So, I'm going to read a book by a writer from England, and his name is Dick King Smith. And if any of you remember, he wrote a book called Babe and the Gallant Pig, and they made a movie about Babe. This book is called Pigs Might Fly. Chapter 1, Taken Away. "Oh no!" cried Mrs. Barley Love miserably. "Oh no!" "What is it, dear?" came the voice of Mrs. Gobblespud next door. "One dead?" "No," said Mrs. Barley Love. "Not yet, anyway." Mrs. Barley Love was a pedigree Gloucester old spots, a flop-eared white pig spotted with black blobs of color, as though a giant had flicked his paintbrush at her. During the night she had given birth to 8 babies, 7 of them all of a size, round and strong-looking, and already plumped out with their first milk. But the 8th pig, she now saw, was a poor, spindly little creature, half as big as the rest, with a head too large for its scrawny body, and a look of hopelessness on its face. It was a runt, a piglet born for some reason far smaller and weaker than its brothers and sisters. In different parts of England they are called by different names: cads, wasters, or nestlegraphs. In Gloucestershire they call them dags. There was a rustling and a scrabbling in the next pigsty, and Mrs. Gobblespud's head appeared over the wall. "Oh, dear me," she said. "Oh, dear me, Mrs. B. Oh, I am so sorry. It isn't just a smallish one, is it?" "No," said Mrs. Barley Love. "It's a real dag." Most of the old spots sows in the range of 9 sties had probably had a dag at some time in their careers as mother pigs. It wasn't thought of as a disgrace, something to be whispered about, because it didn't seem to be anyone's fault. But it was thought to be a pity, a great pity, for every pig's ambition was to rear a fine litter of healthy, evenly matched youngsters, and as the news spread that morning, there was much worried grunting and rolling of eyes and shaking of long droopy ears. The servant wouldn't like it either, they said to each other. They thought of the pig man as a servant, since he did nothing but minister to their wants. He fed them, he watered them, he cleaned them out and brought them fresh bedding. They spoke of him, and to him, though he could not understand this, simply as pigman, as a Roman nobleman might have said slave. Pigman wouldn't be pleased about Mrs. Barley Love's dag, for dags, if they survived, grew very, very slowly and were more trouble than they were worth. Mrs. Barley Love's neighbor on the other side was called Mrs. Swiller, and she was leaning over her wall, gossiping with the next lady down the line, Mrs. Swede-Chopper. "It's not just that it's a dag, Mrs. Swede-Chopper," she said sadly. "From what I can see of the poor little soul, it's deformed." "Deformed, Mrs. Swiller," said Mrs. Swede-Chopper in a tone of horror. "Why, what do you mean?" "Well, its front feet aren't right." "Not right?" "No, they turn inward, and they don't look like pigs' trotters, more like dogs' feet." Mrs. Gobblespud, too, had noticed this further piece of misfortune for poor Mrs. Barley Love, and had told her neighbor, Mrs. Maze Munch, and everywhere heads were sticking up as the sows rested their forefeet comfortably on their boundary walls and discussed the situation. Only at number 5, in the center of the row of pigsties, was no head raised, for Mrs. Barley Love still stood sadly contemplating her misshapen child, while its 7 brothers and sisters squeaked greedily around her legs, begging her to lie down and give them more milk. When she did so, the dag was knocked down in the general rush, and lay for a moment upside down in the straw, his curious club feet waving helplessly. Even when he righted himself and tried to feed, he was continually pushed aside by the others and got very little. From Mrs. Trowlicker at number 1 to Mrs. Grubguzzle at number 9, everybody was convinced of one thing. Pigman would never let this one stay. Pigman'll take him, they said. No doubt about it. Stands to reason with feet like that. Poor little thing. Pigman'll take him away for sure. And gloom hung over the pigsties like a black cloud. The sows never quite knew what happened to a dag, or for that matter, a piglet badly hurt by being stepped or lain on by its mother. They knew that the servant came and removed such an unfortunate, so they simply spoke of it as being taken away. They were unaware of the hardwood club the pigman kept in his shed to deal out a merciful death to the weak and the wounded. Before long, the distant clank of buckets and good smells blowing on the wind told them that the servant was bringing breakfast. The low grunts of concern changed to loud, impatient yells as the dag was forgotten in the excitement of feeding time. "Hurry up, Pigman!" shouted the sows. "Stir your stumps, you lazy thing! He's too slow to catch a cold!" And Mrs. Trowlicker at number 1, who would be the first fed, champed her jaws with a noise like clapping hands, and great dribbles of spit ran out of her mouth. When the pigman had completed his duties and Mrs. Grubguzzle's head was deep in the trough at number 9, he returned to Mrs. Barleylove. Earlier that morning he had seen that the berth was finished and all seemed well, but he had not yet examined the litter. Of course, he immediately saw the dag, and gently and without hesitation picked it up and popped it into the deep pocket of his old apron, unnoticed by the sow busy at her breakfast. There's a picture of the pig man and the baby pig and the club in his other hand. If he had wanted to examine or remove a healthy piglet, he would have clamped its mouth shut to prevent its squeals bringing the mother rushing to his defense. But this one, he thought, didn't even have the strength for a squeak. In the shed, he looked at it more closely. In all his long experience, he had never seen a piglet with such funny forefeet. The little points of the tiny hooves were turned inward toward one another, so that the shape of the foot was not sharp, but rounded, as Mrs. Swiller had said, like a puppy's. Now, Gloucester Old Spots are a rare breed of pig, and the pigman occasionally gave in to the temptation to spare the life of a dag if it was a female. A little sow piglet, or hilt, as he called it, just might grow, even if very slowly, to make a breeding sow one day. But little boar piglets, called hogs, he wanted nothing to do with if they were born weak. Not only was this one a hog, it also had those awful feet. Hanging on a rusty nail was his hardwood club, and the pigman reached for it. End of chapter 1.